Prologue of Captives of the Flame. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Prologue, Captives of the Flame by Samuel R. Delany. The green of beetles' wings, the red of polished carbuncle, a web of silver fire. Lightning tore his eyes apart, struck deep inside his body, and he felt his bones split. Before it became pain, it was gone, and he was falling through blue smoke. The smoke was inside him, cool as blown ice. It was getting darker. He had heard something before, a voice. The Lord of the Flames. Then John Koshar shook his head, staggered forward, and went down on his knees in white sand. He blinked. He looked up. There were two shadows in front of him. To his left, a tooth of rock jutted from the sand, also casting a double shadow. He felt unreal, light, but the backs of his hands had real dirt on them. His clothes were damp with real sweat, and they clung to his back and sides. He felt immense, but that was because the horizon was so close. Above it, the sky was turquoise, which was odd because the sand was too white for it to be evening. Then he saw the city. It hit his eyes with a familiarity that made him start. The familiarity was a refuge, and violently his mind clawed at it, tried to find other familiar things. But the towers, the looped roadways, that was all there was, and one small line of metal ribbon that soared out across the desert, supported by strutwork pylons. The transit ribbon. He followed it with his eyes, praying it would lead to something more familiar. The 13th pylon. He had counted them as he ran his eye along the silver length. Was crumpled, as though a fist had smashed it. The transit ribbon snarled in midair and ceased. The abrupt end again sent his mind clawing back toward familiarity. I am John Koshar. Followed by the meaningless number that had been part of his name for 5 years. I want to be free. And for a moment he saw again the dank, creosoted walls of the cabins of the penal camp, and heard the clinking chains of the cutter teeth, as he had heard them for so many days, walking to the mine entrance, while yard-high ferns brushed his thighs and forearms. But that was in his mind. The only other things his scrambling brain could reach were facts of negation. He was someplace he had never been before. He did not know how he had gotten there. He did not know how to get back. And the close horizon, the double shadows. Now he realized that this was not Earth. Earth of the 35th century, although he gave it another name, 15th century GF. But the city. It was on Earth, and he was on Earth. And he was, had been, in it. Again the negations. The city was not on a desert, nor could its dead, deserted towers cast double shadows, nor was the transit ribbon broken. The transit ribbon! No! It couldn't be broken! He almost screamed, "Don't let it be broken! Please!" The entire scene was suddenly jerked from his head. There was nothing left but blue smoke, cool as blown ice, inside him, around him. He was spinning in blue smoke. Suddenly lightning seared his eyeballs, and the shivering after image faded, shifted, became a web of silver fire, the red of polished carbuncle, the green of beetles' wings. End of Prologue. Of Captives of the Flame by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 1. Silent as a sleeping serpent for 60 years, it spanned from the heart of Telphar to the royal palace of Toromon. From the ashes of the dead city to the island capital, it connected what once had been the two major cities, the only cities of Toromon. Today there was only one. In Telphar, it soared above ashes and fallen roadways into the night. Miles on, the edge of darkness paled before the morning, and in the faint shadow of the transit ribbon, at the edge of a field of lava, among the whispering, yard-high ferns, sat row on row of squat shacks, cheerless as roosting macaws. They stood near the entrance of the tetron mines. A few moments before, the light rain had stopped. Water dribbled down the supporting columns of the transit ribbon, which made a black band on the fading night. Now, 6 extraordinarily tall men left the edge of the jungle. They carried 2 corpses among them. 2 of the tall men hung back to converse. "The third one won't get very far." "If he does," said the other, "he'll be the first one to get through the forest guards in 12 years." "I'm not worried about his escaping," said the first. "But why have there been such an increase in attempts over the past year?" The other one laughed. Even in the dull light, the 3 scars that ran down the side of his face and neck were visible. "The orders for tetron have nearly doubled. I wonder just what sort of leeches in Toron make their living off these miserable—" He didn't finish, but pointed ahead to the corpses. "The hydroponic growers, the aquarium manufacturers," answered the man with the scars. "They're the ones who use the ore. Then, of course, there's the preparation for the war." "They say that since the artificial food growers have taken over, the farmers and fishermen near the coast are being starved out. And with the increased demand for tetron, the miners are dying off like flies here at the mine. Sometimes I wonder how they supply enough prisoners." "They don't," said the other. Now he called out, "All right, just drop them there, in front of the cabins." The rain had made the ground mud. 2 dull splashes came through the graying morning. "Maybe that'll teach them some sort of lesson," said the first. "Maybe," shrugged the one with the scars. Now they turned back toward the jungle. Soon streaks of light speared the yellow clouds and pried apart the billowing rifts. Shafts of yellow sank into the lush jungles of Toromon, dropping from wet, green fronds, or catching on the moist cracks of boulders. Then the dawn snagged on the metal ribbon that arced over the trees, and webs of shadow from the immense supporting pylons fell across the few gutted lava beds that dotted the forest. A formation of airships flashed through a tear in the clouds, like a handful of hurled silver chips, as the buzz from their tetron motors descended through the trees. Quorl, the forest guard, stretched his 7-foot body and rolled over, crushing leaves beneath his shoulder. Instinctively his stomach tensed. But silence had returned. With large, yellow-brown eyes, he looked about the grove in which he had spent the night. His broad nostrils flared even wider. But the air was still, clean, safe. Above, the metal ribbon glinted. Quorl lay back on the dried leaves once more. As dawn slipped across the jungle, more and more of the ribbon caught fire from beneath the receding shadows, till at last it soared above the yellow crescent of sand that marked the edge of the sea. 50 yards down the beach from the last supporting pylon whose base still sat on dry land, Sithon, the fisherman, emerged from his shack. "Tel?" he called. He was a brown, wiry man whose leathery face was netted with lines from sand and wind. "Tel," he called once more. Now he turned back into the cottage. "And where has the boy gotten off to now?" Grella had already seated herself at the loom, and her strong hands now began to work the shuttle back and forth, while her feet stamped the treadle. "Where has he gone?" Cithon demanded. "He went out early this morning," Grella said quietly. She did not look at her husband. She watched the shuttle moving back and forth, between the green and yellow threads. "I can see he's gone out," Cithon snapped. "But where? The sun is up. He should be out with me on the boat. When will he be back?" Grella didn't answer. "When will he be back?" Cithon demanded. "I don't know." Outside there was a sound, and Cithon turned abruptly and went to the side of the shack. The boy was leaning over the water trough, sloshing his face. "Tell." The boy looked up quickly at his father. He was, perhaps, 14, a thin child, with a shock of black hair, yet eyes as green as the sea. Fear had widened them now. "Where were you?" "No place," was the boy's quietly defensive answer. "I wasn't doing anything." "Where were you?" "No place," Tel mumbled again. "Just walking." Suddenly Cithon's hand, which had been at his waist, jerked up and then down, and the leather strap that had been his belt slashed over the boy's wet shoulder. The only sound was a sudden intake of breath. "Now get down to the boat." Inside the shack, the shuttle paused in Grella's fist the length of a drawn breath. Then it shot once more between the threads. Down the beach, the transit ribbon leapt across the water. Light shook on the surface of the sea like flung diamonds, and the ribbon above was dull by comparison. Dawn reached across the water till at last the early light fell on the shore of an island. High in the air, the ribbon gleamed above the busy piers and the early morning traffic of the wharf. Behind the piers, the towers of the city were lanced with gold, and as the sun rose, gold light dropped further down the building faces. On the boardwalk, two merchants were talking above the roar of tetron-powered winches and chuckling carts. "It looks like your boat's bringing in a cargo of fish," said the stout one. "It could be fish, it could be something else," answered the other. "Tell me, friend," asked the portly one, whose coat was of cut and cloth expensive enough to suggest his guesses were usually right, "why do you trouble to send your boat all the way to the mainland to buy from the little fishermen there? My aquariums can supply the city with all the food it needs." The other merchant looked down at the clipboard of inventory slips. "Perhaps my clientele is somewhat different from yours." The first merchant laughed. "Ha! You sell to the upper families of the city, who still insist on the doubtful superiority of your imported delicacies. Did you know, my friend, I am superior in every way to you? I feed more people, so what I produce is superior to what you produce. I charge them less money, and so I am financially more benevolent than you. I make more money than you do, so I am also financially superior. Also, later this morning my daughter is coming back from the university, and this evening I will give her a party so great and so lavish that she will love me more than any daughter has ever loved a father before." Here the self-satisfied merchant laughed again, and turned down the wharf to inspect a cargo of tetron ore that was coming in from the mainland. As the merchant of imported fish turned up another inventory slip, another man approached him. "What was old Koshar laughing about?" he asked. "He was gloating over his good fortune and backing that harebrained aquarium idea. He was also trying to make me jealous of his daughter. He's giving her a party tonight to which I am no doubt invited. But the invitation will come late this afternoon with no time for me to reply properly." The other man shook his head. "He's a proud man, but you can bring him to his place. Next time he mentions his daughter, ask him about his son, and watch the shame storm into his face." "He may be proud," said the other, "but I am not cruel. Why should I move to hurt him? Time takes care of her own. This coming war will see." "Perhaps," said the other merchant, "perhaps." Once over the island city of Toron, capital of Toromon, the transit ribbon breaks from its even course and bends among the towers, weaves among the elevated highways, till finally it crosses near a wide splash of bare concrete, edged with block-long aircraft hangars. Several airships had just arrived, and at one of the passenger gates the people waiting for arrivals crowded closely to the metal fence. Among them was one young man in military uniform, a brush of red hair, eyes that seemed doubly dark in his pale face, along with a squat taurine power in his legs and shoulders. These were what struck you in the swift glance. A close look brought you the incongruity of the major's insignia and his obvious youth. He watched the passengers coming through the gate with more than military interest. Someone called, "Tomar!" and he turned, a grin leaping to his face. "Tomar," she called again, "I'm over here." A little too bumptiously, he rammed through the crowd until at last he almost collided with her. Then he stopped, looking bewildered and happy. "Gee, I'm glad you came," she said. "Come on, you can walk me back to Father's." Her black hair fell close to broad, nearly oriental cheekbones. Then the smile on her first strangely, then attractively pale mouth fell. Tomar shook his head as they turned now, arm in arm, among the people wandering over the field. "No?" she asked. "Why not?" "I don't have time, Clea," he answered. "I had to sneak an hour off just to get here. I'm supposed to be back at the military ministry in 40 minutes. Hey, do you have any bags I can carry?" Clea held up a slide rule and a notebook. "I'm traveling light. In a week I'll be back at the university for summer courses, so I didn't bring any clothes. Wait a minute, you're not going to be too busy to get to the party Dad's giving me tonight, are you?" Tomar shrugged. Clea began a word, but pushed her tongue hard against the roof of her mouth. "Tomar?" she asked after a moment. "Yes?" He had a rough voice, which, when he was sad, took on the undertones of a bear's growl. "What's happening about the war? Will there really be one?" Again he shrugged. "More soldiers, more planes. And at the ministry there's more and more work to do. I was up before dawn this morning, getting a fleet of survey planes off for a scouting trip to the mainland, over the radiation barrier. If they come back this evening, I'll be busy all night with the reports and I won't be able to make the party." "Oh," said Clea. "Tomar?" "Yes, Clea Koshar?" "Oh, don't be formal with me, please. You've been in the city long enough and known me long enough. Tomar, if the war comes, do you think they'll draft prisoners from the tetron mines into the army?" "They talk about it." "Because my brother." "I know," said Tomar. "And if a prisoner from the mines distinguished himself as a soldier, would he be free at the end of the war? They wouldn't send him back to the mines, would they?" "The war hasn't even begun yet," said Tomar. "No one knows how it will end." "You're right," she said, "as usual." They reached the gate. "Look, Tomar, I don't want to keep you if you're busy, but you've got to promise to come see me and spend at least an afternoon before I go back to school."
"If the war starts, you won't be going back to school."
"Why not?"
You already have your degree in theoretical physics. Now you're only doing advanced work. Not only will they conscript prisoners from the mines, but all scientists, engineers, and mathematicians will have to lend their efforts to the cause as well."
"I was afraid of that," Clea said. "You believe the war will actually come, don't you, Tomar?" "They get ready for it night and day," Tomar said. "What is there to stop it? When I was a boy on my father's farm on the mainland, there was too much work and no food. I was a strong boy with a strong boy's stomach. I came to the city, and I took my strength to the army. Now I have work that I like. I'm not hungry. With the war there will be work for a lot more people. Your father will be richer, your brother may come back to you, and even the thieves and beggars in the Devil's Pot will have a chance to do some honest work." "Perhaps," said Clea. "Look, like I said, I don't want to keep you. I mean I do, but, well, when will you have some time?"
Probably tomorrow afternoon."
"Fine," said Clea. "We'll have a picnic then, all right?" Tomar grinned.
"Yes," he said.
"Yes." He took both her hands, and she smiled back at him. Then he turned away, and was gone through the crowd. Clea watched a moment, and then turned toward the taxi stand. The sun was beginning to warm the air as she pushed into the shadow of the great transit ribbon that soared above her between the towers. Buildings dropped bands of shadow across the ribbon as it wound through the city, although occasional streaks of light from an eastward street still made silver half rings around it. At the center of the city, it raised a final 200 feet and entered the window of the laboratory tower in the west wing of the royal palace of Toron. The room in which the transit ribbon ended was deserted. At the end of the metal band was a transparent crystal sphere, 15 feet in diameter, which hovered above the receiving platform. A dozen small tetron units of varying sizes sat around the room. The viewing screens were dead gray. On a control panel by one ornate window, a bank of 49 scarlet knobbed switches pointed to off. The metal catwalks that ran over the receiving platform were empty. In another room of the palace, however, someone was screaming. "Tetron!" "If your Highness would only wait a moment to hear the report," began the aged minister. "I believe " "Tetron!" "You would understand the necessity," he continued in an amazingly calm voice, "of disturbing you at such an ungodly hour." "I never want to hear the word tetron again." "Of the morning." "Go away, Chargill. I'm sleeping." King Oski, who had just turned 21, though he had been the official ruler of Toromon since the age of 7, jammed his pale blond head beneath 3 overstuffed pillows that lay about the purple silken sheets of his bed. With one too slender hand he sought feebly around for the covers to hide himself completely. The old minister quietly picked up the edge of the ermine-rimmed coverlet and held it out of reach. After several half-hearted swipes, the pale head emerged once more and asked in a coldly quiet voice, "Chargill, why is it that roads have been built, prisoners have been reprieved, and traitors have been disemboweled at every hour of the afternoon and evening without anyone expressing the least concern for what I thought? Now suddenly, at..." Uske peered at the jewel-crusted chronometer by his bed, in which a shimmering gold light fixed the hour. "My God, 10 o'clock in the morning! Why must I suddenly be consulted at every little twist and turn of Empire?" "First," explained Chargill, "you are now of age. Secondly, we are about to enter a war, and in times of stress, responsibility is passed to the top, and you, sir, are in the unfortunate position."
"Why can't we have a war and get it over with?" said Uske, rolling over to face Chargill and becoming a trifle more amenable. "I'm tired of all this idiocy. You don't think I'm a very good king, do you?" The young man sat up and planted his slender feet as firmly as possible on the 3-inch thick fur rug. "Well, if we had a war," he continued, scratching his stomach through his pink sateen pajama top, "I'd ride in the first line of fire in the most splendid uniform imaginable, and lead my soldiers to a sweeping victory." At the word sweeping, he threw himself under the covers. "Commendable sentiment," started Chargill dryly. "And seeing that there may just be a war before the afternoon arrives, why don't you listen to the report, which merely says that another scouting flight of planes has been crippled trying to observe the enemy just beyond the tetron mines over the radiation barrier?" "Let me continue it for you. No one knows how the planes have been crippled, but the efficacy of their methods has led the council to suggest that we consider the possibility of open war even more strongly. Isn't this more or less what the reports have been for weeks?"
"It is," replied Chargill.
"Then why bother me? Incidentally, must we really go to that imbecilic party for that stupid fish peddler's daughter this evening? And talk about tetron as little as possible, please."
"I need not remind you," went on the patient Chargill, "that this stupid fish peddler has amassed a fortune nearly as large as that in the royal treasury, though I doubt if he is aware of the comparison, through the proper exploitation of the unmentionable metal. If there is a war, and we should need to borrow funds, it should be done with as much goodwill as possible. Therefore you will attend his party, to which he has so kindly invited you."
"Listen a minute, Chargill," said Uske, "and I'm being serious now. This war business is completely ridiculous, and if you expect me to take it seriously, then the council is going to have to take it seriously. How can we have a war with whatever is behind the radiation barrier? We don't know anything about it. Is it a country? Is it a city? Is it an empire? We don't even know if it's got a name. We don't know how they've crippled our scouting planes. We can't monitor any radio communication. Of course, we couldn't do that anyway with the radiation barrier. We don't even know if it's people. One of our silly planes gets its tetron. Pardon me, if you can't say it, I shouldn't say it either. Device knocked out and a missile hurled at it. Bango! The council says war. Well, I refuse to take it seriously. Why do we keep on wasting planes anyway? Why not send a few people through the transit ribbon to do some spying?"
Chargill looked amazed. "Before we instituted the penal mines, and just after we annexed the forest people, the transit ribbon was built, correct? Now where does it go?" "Into the dead city of Telphar," answered Chargill. "Exactly. And Telphar was not at all dead when we built it 60 years ago. The radiation hadn't progressed that far. Well, why not send spies into Telphar and from there across the barrier and into enemy territory? Then they can come back and tell us everything." Uske smiled. "Of course your Majesty is joking," Chargill smiled. "May I remind your Majesty that the radiation level in Telphar today is fatal to human beings. Completely fatal. The enemy seems to be well beyond the barrier. Only recently, with the great amount of tetron, excuse me, coming from the mines, have we been able to develop planes that can perhaps go over it. And that, when and if we can do it, is the only way." Uske had started out smiling. It turned into a giggle, then to a laugh. Suddenly he cried out and threw himself down on the bed. "Nobody listens to me! Nobody takes any of my suggestions!" he moaned, and stuck his head under the pillows. "No one does anything but contradict me. Go away! Get out! Let me sleep!" Chargill sighed and withdrew from the royal bedchamber. End of chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Captives of the Flame by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 2. It had been silent for 60 years. Then, above the receiving stage in the laboratory tower of the royal palace of Toromon, the great transparent crystal sphere glowed. On the stage, a blue haze shimmered. Red flame shot through the mist, a net of scarlet, contracting, pulsing, outlining the recognizable patterning of veins and arteries. Along the running fires, the shadow of bones formed a human skeleton in the blue, till suddenly the shape was laced with sudden silver, the net of nerves that held the body imprisoned in sensation. The blue became opaque. Then the black-haired man, barefooted, in rags, staggered forward to the rail and held on for a moment. Above, the crystal faded. He blinked his eyes hard before he looked up. He looked around. "All right," he said out loud. "Where the hell are you?" He paused. "Okay, okay, I know. I'm not supposed to get dependent on you. I guess I'm all right now, aren't I?" Another pause. "Well, I feel fine." He let go of the rail and looked at his hands, back and palms. "Dirty as hell," he mumbled. "Wonder where I can get washed up." He looked up. "Yeah, sure. Why not?" He ducked under the railing and vaulted to the floor. Once again he looked around. "So I'm really in the castle. After all these years. I never thought I'd see it. Yeah, I guess it really is." He started forward, but as he passed under the shadow of the great ribbon's end, something happened. He faded. At least the exposed parts of his body, head, hands, and feet, faded. He stopped and looked down. Through his ghost-like feet, he could see the rivets that held down the metal floor. He made a disgusted face and continued toward the door. Once in the sunlight, he solidified again. There was no one in the hall. He walked along, ignoring the triptych of silver partitions that marked the consultant chamber. A stained glass window further on, rotated by silent machinery, flung colors over his face as he passed. A golden disk chronometer, fixed in the ceiling behind a carved crystal face, said 10:30. Suddenly he stopped in front of a book cabinet and opened the glass door. "Here's the one," he said out loud again. "Yeah, I know we haven't got time, but it will explain it to you better than I can." He pulled a book from the row of books. "We used this in school," he said, "a long time ago." The book was Catham's Revised History of Toromon. He opened the shark-skin cover and flipped a few pages into the text. "From a few libraries that survived the Great Fire, from which we will date all subsequent events, civilization was reduced beyond barbarism. But eventually the few survivors on the island of Toron established a settlement, a village, a city. Now they pushed to the mainland, and the shore became the central source of food for the island's population, which now devoted itself to manufacturing. On the coast, farms and fishing villages flourished. On the island, science and industry became sudden factors in the life of Toromon, now an empire. Beyond the plains at the coast, explorers discovered the forest people,
who lived in the strip of jungle that held in its crescent the stretch of mainland. They were a mutant breed, gigantic in physical stature, peaceful in nature. They quickly became part of Toromon's empire with no resistance. Beyond the jungle were the gutted fields of lava and dead earth, and it was here that the strange metal, tetron, was discovered. A great empire has a great crime rate, and our penal system was used to supply miners for the tetron. Now technology leapt ahead, and we developed many uses for the power that could be released from the tetron. Then, beyond the lava fields, we discovered what it was that had enlarged the bodies of the forest people, what it was that had killed all green things beyond the jungle. Lingering from the days of the Great Fire, a wide strip of radioactive land still burned all around the lava fields, cutting us off from further expansion. Going toward that field of death, the plants became gnarled, distorted caricatures of themselves, then only rock. Death was long if a man ventured in and came back. First, immense thirst. Then the skin dries out. Blindness, fever, madness, at last death. This is what awaited the transgressor. It was at the brink of the radiation barrier, in defiance of death, that Telphar was established. It was far enough away to be safe, yet near enough to see the purple glow at the horizon over the broken hills. At the same time, experiments were being conducted with elementary matter transmission, and, as a token to this new direction of science, the transit ribbon was commissioned to link the two cities. It was more a gesture of the solidarity of Toromon's empire than a practical appliance. Only 300 or 400 pounds of matter could be sent at once, or 2 or 3 people. The transportation was instantaneous, and portended a future of great exploration to any part of the world, with theoretical travel to the stars. Then, at 7:32 on an autumn evening, 60 years ago, a sudden increase in the pale light was observed in the radiation saturated west by the citizens of Telphar. 7 hours later, the entire sky above Telphar was flickering with streaks of pale blue and yellow. Evacuation had begun already, but in 3 days Telphar was dead. The sudden rise in radiation has been attributed to many things in theory, but as yet an irrefutable explanation is still wanted. The advance of the radiation stopped well before the tetron mines. However, Telphar was not lost to Toron for good, and Jon suddenly closed the book. "You see," he said, "that's why I was afraid when I saw where I was. That's why—" He stopped, shrugged. "You're not listening," he said, and put the book back on the shelf. Down the hallway 50 feet, 2 ornate stairways branched right and left. He waited with his hands shoved into his pockets, looking absently toward another window, like a person waiting for someone else to make up his mind. But the decision was not forthcoming. At last, belligerently, he started up the stairway to the left. Halfway up, he became a little more cautious, his bare feet padding softly, his broad hand preceding him wearily on the banister. He turned down another hallway where carved busts and statues sat in niches in the walls, a light glowing blue behind those to the left, yellow behind those to the right. A sound from around a corner sent him behind a pink marble mermaid playing with a garland of seaweed. The old man who walked by was carrying a folder and looked serenely and patiently preoccupied. Jon waited without breathing the space of 3 ordinary breaths. Then he ducked out and sprinted down the hall. At last he stopped before a group of doors. "Which one?" he demanded. This time he must have gotten an answer, because he went to one, opened it, and slipped in. Uske had pulled the silken sheet over his head. He heard several small clicks and tiny brushing noises, but they came through the fog of sleep that had been washing back over him since Chargill's departure. The first sound, definite enough to wake him, was water against tile. He listened to it for nearly 2 minutes through the languid veil of fatigue. It was only when it stopped that he frowned, pushed back the sheet, and sat up. The door to his private bath was open. The light was off, but someone, or thing, was apparently finishing a shower. The windows of his room were covered with thick drapes, but he hesitated to push the button that would reel them back from the sun. He heard the rings of the shower curtain sliding along the shower rod, the rattle of the towel rack. Silence. A few whistled notes. Suddenly he saw that dark spots were forming on the great fur rug that sprawled across the black stone floor. One after another. Footprints! Incorporeal footprints were coming toward him slowly. When they were about 4 feet away from his bed, he slammed the flat of his palm on the button that drew back the curtains. Sunlight filled the room like bright water. And, standing in the last pair of footprints, was the sudden, naked figure of a man. He leapt at Uske as the King threw himself face down into the mound of pillows and tried to scream at the same time. Immediately he was caught, pulled up, and the edge of a hand was thrust into his open mouth so that when he bit down he chomped the inside of his cheeks. "Will you keep still, stupid?" a voice whispered behind him. The King went limp. "There. Now, just a second." A hand reached past Uske's shoulder, pressed the button on the night table by the bed, and the curtain swept across the window. The hand went out as if it had been aflame. "Now you keep still and be quiet." The pressure released, and the King felt the bed give as the weight lifted. He held still for a moment. Then he whirled around. There wasn't anyone there. "Where do you keep your clothes, huh? You always were about my size." "Over there. There, in that closet." The bodiless footprints padded over the fur rug, and the closet door opened. Hangers slid along the rack. The bureau at the back of the closet was opened. "This'll do fine. I didn't think I was ever going to get into decent clothes again. Just a second." There was the sound of tearing thread. "This jacket will fit me all right, once I get these shoulder pads out of it." Something came out of the closet, dressed now. A human form, only without head or hands. "Now that I'm decent, open up those curtains and throw some light around the place." The standing suit of clothes waited. "Well, come on, open the curtains." Slowly Uske reached for the button. A freshly shaven young man with black hair stood in the sunlight, examining his cuffs. An open brocade jacket with metalwork filigree covered a white silk shirt that laced over a wide V neck. The tight gray trousers were belted with a broad strip of black leather and fastened with a gold disc. The black boots, opened at the toe and heel, were topped with similar discs. Jon Koshar looked around. "It's good to be back." "Who? What are you?" whispered Uske. "Loyal subject of the crown," said Jon. "You squid-brained clam." Uske sputtered. "Think back about 5 years to when you and I were in school together." A flicker of recognition showed in the blond face. "You remember a kid who was a couple of years ahead of you and got you out of a beating when the kids in the mechanics class were going to gang up on you because you'd smashed a high frequency coil on purpose. And remember you dared that same kid to break into the castle and steal the Royal Herald from the throne room? In fact, you gave him the fire blade to do it too. Only that wasn't mentioned in the trial. Did you also alert the guards that I was coming? I was never quite sure of that part." "Look," began Uske. "You're crazy." "I might have been a little crazy then, but 5 years out in the tetron mines has brought me pretty close to my senses." "You're a murderer." "It was in self-defense and you know it. Those guards that converged on me weren't kidding. I didn't kill him on purpose. I just didn't want to get my head seared off." "So you seared one of their heads off first. John Koshar, I think you're crazy. What are you doing here anyway?" "It would take too long to explain. But believe me, the last thing I came back for was to see you again." "So you come in, steal my clothing." Suddenly he laughed. "Oh, of course. I'm dreaming all this. How silly of me. I must be dreaming." John frowned. Uske went on. "I must be feeling guilty about that whole business when we were kids. You keep on disappearing and appearing. You can't possibly be more than a figment of my imagination. Koshar! The name! Of course, that's the name of the people who are giving the party that I'm going to once I wake up. That's the reason for the whole thing." "What party?" John demanded. "Your father is giving it for your sister. Yes, that's right. You had quite a pretty sister. I'm going back to sleep now, and when I wake up, you're to be gone. Do you understand? What a silly dream." "Just a moment. Why are you going?" Uske snuggled his head into the pillow. "Apparently your father has managed to amass quite a fortune. Chargill says I have to treat him kindly so we can borrow money from him later on. Unless I'm dreaming that up too." "You're not dreaming." Uske opened one eye, closed it again, and rolled over onto the pillow. "Tell that to my cousin, the Duchess of Petra. She was dragged all the way from her island estate to come to this thing. The only people who are getting out of it are mother and my kid brother. Lucky starfish." "Go back to sleep," said John. "Go away," said Uske. He opened his eyes once more to see John push the button that pulled the curtains, and then the headless, handless figure went to the door and out. Uske shuddered and pulled the covers up again. John walked down the hall. Behind the door to one room that he did not enter, the red-headed Duchess of Petra was standing by the window of her apartment, gazing over the roofs of the city, the great houses of the wealthy merchants and manufacturers, over the hive-like buildings which house the city's doctors, clerks, secretaries, and storekeepers, down to the reeking clapboard and stone alleys of the Devil's Pot. The early sun lay flame in her hair and whitened her pale face. She pushed the window open a bit, and the breeze waved her blue robe as she absently fingered a smoky crystal set in a silver chain around her neck. John continued down the hall. 3 doors away, the old queen lay on the heap of overstuffed mattresses, nestled in the center of an immense four-poster bed. Her white hair was coiled in 2 buns on either side of her head. Her mouth was slightly open and a faint breath hissed across the white lips. On the wall above the bed hung the portrait of the late King Alsen, sceptered, official, and benevolent. In a set of rooms just beside the Queen Mother's chamber, Let, Prince of the Royal Blood, heir apparent to the Empire of Toromon, and half a dozen more, was sitting in just his pajama top on the edge of his bed, knuckling his eyes. The thin limbs of the 13-year-old were still slightly akimbo with natural awkwardness and sleep. Like his brother, he was blond and slight. Still blinking, he slipped into his underwear and trousers, pausing a moment to check his watch. He fastened the 3 snaps on his shirt, turned to the palace intercom, and pressed a button. "I overslept, Petra," Let apologized. "Anyway, I'm up now." "You must learn to be on time. Remember, you are heir to the throne of Toromon. You mustn't forget that." Sometimes I wish I could, replied Let. Sometimes. Never say that again, came the sudden command through the tiny intercom. Do you hear me? Never even let yourself think that for a moment. I'm sorry, Petra, Let said. His cousin, the Duchess, had been acting strangely since her arrival 2 days ago. 15 years his senior, she was still the member of the family to whom he felt closest. Usually, with her, he could forget the crown that was always being pointed to as it dangled above his head. His brother was not very healthy, nor even, as some rumored, all in his proper mind. Yet now it was Petra herself who was pointing out the gold circlet of Toromon's kingship. It seemed a betrayal. Anyway, he went on, here I am. What did you want? To say good morning. The smile in the voice brought a smile to Let's face, too. Do you remember that story I told you last night about the prisoners in the Tetron mines? Sure, said Let, who had fallen asleep thinking about it. The ones who were planning an escape. She had sat in the garden with him for an hour after dark, regaling him with the harrowing details of 3 prisoners' attempt to escape the penal mines. She had terminated it at the height of suspense, with the 3 men crouching by the steps in the darkness and the drizzling rain, waiting to make their dash into the forest. You said you were going to go on with it this morning. Do you really want to hear the end of the story? Of course I do. I couldn't get to sleep for hours thinking about it. Well, said Petra, when the guard changed and the rope tripped him up when he was coming down the steps, the rear guard ran around to see what had happened, as planned, and they dashed through the searchlight beam into the forest and she paused. Anyway, one of them made it. The other 2 were caught and killed. Huh? Said Let. Is that all? That's about it, said Petra. What do you mean? Let demanded. Last night's version had contained detail upon detail of the prisoners' treatment, their efforts to dig a tunnel, the precautions they took, along with an uncannily vivid description of the scenery that had made him shiver as though he had been in the leaky, rotten walled shacks. You can't just finish it up like that, he exclaimed. How did they get caught? Which one got away? Was it the chubby one with the freckles? How did they die? Unpleasantly, Petra answered. No, the chubby one with the freckles didn't make it. They brought him and the one with the limp back that morning in the rain and dropped them in the mud outside the barracks to discourage further escape attempts. Oh, said Let. What about the one who did make it? He asked after a moment. Instead of answering, she said, Let, I want to give you a warning. The prince stiffened a bit, but she began differently than he expected. Let, in a little while you may be going on quite an adventure, and you may want to forget some things, because it will be easier, like being the Prince of Toromon. But don't forget it, Let. Don't. What sort of adventure, Petra? Again, she did not answer his question. Let, do you remember how I described the prison to you? What would you do if you were king and those prisoners were under your rule, with their rotten food, the rats, their 14 hours of labor a day in the mines? Well, I don't know, Petra, he began, feeling as if something were being asked of him that he was reluctant to give. It was like when his history teacher expected him to know the answer on a question of government just because he had been born into it. I suppose I'd have to consult the council and see what Chargill said. It would depend on the individual prisoners and what they'd done, and of course how the people felt about it. Chargill always says you shouldn't do things too quickly. I know what Chargill says, said the Duchess quietly. Just remember what I've said, will you? What about the third man, the one who escaped? He came back to Toron. He must have had a lot more adventures. What happened to him, Petra? Come on, tell me. Actually, said Petra, he managed to bypass most of the adventures. He came very quickly. Let me see. After they dashed across the searchlit area, they ducked into the jungle. Almost immediately, the three got separated. The black-haired one got completely turned around and wandered in the wrong direction until he had gone past the mines, out of the forest, and across the rocky stretch of ground beyond, a good 5 miles. By the time it was light enough to see, he suddenly realized he had been wandering toward the radiation barrier, because in the distance, like a black skeleton on the horizon, were the abandoned ruins of Telphar, the dead city. Shouldn't he have been dead from the radiation? That's exactly what he figured. In fact, he figured if he was close enough to see the place, he should have been dead a few miles back. He was tired. The food they'd taken kept him from being hungry. But he was definitely alive. Finally, he decided that he might as well go toward the city. He took 2 steps more, when suddenly he heard something. There was silence over the intercom. After he had allowed sufficient time for a dramatic pause, Let asked, "What was it? What did he hear?" "If you ever hear it," Petra said, "you'll know it." "Come on, Petra, what was it?" "I'm quite serious," Petra said. "That's all I know of the story. And that's all you need to know. Maybe I'll be able to finish it when I come back from the party tonight." "Please, Petra." "That's it." He paused for a minute. "Petra, is the adventure I'm supposed to have the war? Is that why you're reminding me not to forget?" "I wish it were that simple, Let. Let's say that's part of it." "Oh," said Let. "Just promise to remember the story and what I've said." "I will," said Let, wondering. "I will." Jon walked down a long spiral staircase, nodded to the guard at the foot, passed into the castle garden, paused to squint at the sun, and went out the gate. Getting in was a lot more difficult. End of chapter 2. Of Captives of the Flame by Samuel R. Delany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Matt Perard. Chapter 3. The Devil's Pot overturned its foul jelly at the city's edge. 13 alleys lined with old stone houses was its nucleus. Many of them were ruined, built over, and ruined again. These were the oldest structures in Toron. Thick with humanity and garbage, it reached from the waterfront to the border of the hive houses in which lived the clerks and professionals of Toron. Clapboard alternated with hastily constructed sheet metal buildings, with no room between. The metal rusted, the clapboard sagged. The waterfront housed the temporary prison, the immigration offices, and the launch service that went out to the aquariums and hydroponics plants that floated on vast pontoons 3 miles away. At the dock, a frog-like, sooty hulk had pulled in nearly an hour ago, but the passengers were only being allowed to come ashore now, and that after passing their papers through the inspection of a row of officials who sat behind a wooden table. A flimsy, waist-high structure of boards separated the passengers from the people on the wharf. The passengers milled. A few had bundles. Many had nothing. They stood quietly, or ambled aimlessly. On the waterfront street,
The noise was thunderous. Peddlers hawking, pushcarts trundling, the roar of arguing voices. Some passengers gazed across the fence at the sprawling slum. Most did not. As they filed past the officers and onto the dock, a woman with a box of trinkets and a brown-red birthmark splashed over the left side of her face pushed among the new arrivals. Near 50, she wore a dress and head rag that were a well-washed, featureless gray. "And would you like to buy a pair of shoelaces? Fine strong ones," she accosted a young man who returned a bewildered smile of embarrassment. "I don't got any money," he stammered, though complimented by the attention. Rara glanced down at his feet. "Apparently you have no shoes either. Well, good luck here in the New World, the island of opportunity." She brushed by him and aimed toward a man and a woman who carried a bundle composed of a hoe, a rake, a shovel, and a baby. "A picture," she said, digging into her box, "of our illustrious Majesty, King Usk, with a real metal frame, hand painted in miniature in honor of his birthday. No true cosmopolitan patriot can be without one." The woman with the baby leaned over to see the palm-sized portrait of a vague young man with blond hair and a crown. "Is that really the king?" "Of course it is," declared the birthmarked vendress. "He sat for it in person. Look at that noble face. It would be a real inspiration to the little one there, when and if he grows up." "How much is it?" the woman asked. Her husband frowned. "For a hand-painted picture," said Rara, "it's very cheap. Say half a unit." "It's pretty," said the woman, then caught the frown on the man's face. She dropped her eyes and shook her head. Suddenly the man, from somewhere, thrust a half-unit piece into Rara's hand. "Here." He took the picture and handed it to his wife. As she looked at it, he nodded his head. "It is pretty," he said. "Yes, it is." "Good luck here in the New World," commented Rara. "Welcome to the island of opportunity." Turning, she drew out the next gewgaw her hand touched, glanced at it long enough to see what it was, and said to the man she now faced, "I see you could certainly use a spool of fine thread to good purpose." She pointed to a hole in his sleeve. "There." A brown shoulder showed through his shirt, further up. "And there." "I could use a needle, too," he answered her. "And I could use a new shirt and a bucket of gold." Suddenly he spat. "I've as much chance of getting one as the other with what I've got in my pocket." "Oh, surely a spool of fine, strong thread " Suddenly someone pushed her from behind. "All right, move on, lady. You can't peddle here." "I certainly can," exclaimed Rara, whirling. "I've got my license right here. Just let me find it now." "Nobody has a license to peddle in front of the Immigration Building. Now move on." "Good luck in the new land," she called over her shoulder as the officer forced her away. "Welcome to the island of opportunity." Suddenly a commotion started behind the gate. Someone was having trouble with papers. Then a dark-haired, barefoot boy broke from his place in line, ran to the wooden gate, and vaulted over. The wooden structure was flimsy. As the boy landed, feet running, the fence collapsed. Behind the fence they hesitated like an unbroken wave. Then they came. At the table the officials stood up, waved their hands, shouted, then stood on their benches and shouted some more. The officer who had shoved the vending woman disappeared in the wash of bodies. Rara clutched her box of trinkets and scurried to the corner, then melded with the herding crowd for 2 blocks into the slums. "Rara!" She stopped and looked around. "Oh, there you are," she said, joining a young girl who stood back from the crowd, holding a box of trinkets like the other woman's. "Rara, what happened?" The birthmarked woman laughed. "You are watching the beginning of the transformation. Fear, hunger, a little more fear, no work, more fear, and every last one of these poor souls will be a first class, grade A citizen of the Devil's Pot. How much did you sell?" "Just a couple of units worth," the girl answered. She was perhaps 16, with a strange combination of white hair, blue eyes, and skin that had tanned richly and quickly, giving her the large eyed look of an exotic snow maned animal. "Why are they running?" "Some boy started a panic. The fence gave way and the rest followed him." A second surge of people rounded the corner. "Welcome to the new land, the Island of Opportunity," Rara called out. Then she laughed. "Where are they all going to?" Alter asked. "Into the holes in the ground, into the cracks in the street. The lucky men will get into the army, but even that won't absorb them all. The women, the children?" She shrugged. Just then a boy's voice came from halfway down the block. "Hey!" They turned. "Why, that's the boy that broke the fence down!" exclaimed Rara. "What does he want?" "I don't know. Before this afternoon I'd never seen him in my life." He was dark, with black hair, but as he approached they saw that his eyes were water green. "You're the woman who was selling things, huh?" Rara nodded. "What do you want to buy?" "I don't want to buy anything," he said. "I want to sell something to you." He was barefoot, his pants frayed into nothing at mid calf, and his sleeveless shirt had no fastenings. "What do you want to sell?" she asked, her voice deepening with skepticism. He reached into his pocket and brought out a rag of green flannel, which he unwrapped now in his hand. They had been polished to a milky hue, some streaked with gold and red, others run through with warm browns and yellows. Two had been rubbed down to pure mother of pearl, rubbed until their muted silver surfaces were clouded with pastel lusters. There, in the nest of green, they swirled around themselves, shimmering. "They're nothing but seashells," Rara said. Alter reached her forefinger out and touched a white periwinkle. "They're lovely," she told him. "Where did you get them?" They ranged in size from the first joint of her thumb to the width of her pinky nail. "By your departed mother, my own sister, we can't afford to give him a centi-unit, Alter. I hardly sold a thing before that brute officer forced me away." "I found them on the beach," the boy explained. "I was hiding on the boat, and I didn't have nothing to do, so I polished them." "What were you hiding for?" asked Rara, her voice suddenly sharp. "You don't mean you stowed away?" "Uh-huh," the boy nodded. "How much do you want for them?" Alter asked. "How much? How much would it cost to get a meal and a place to stay?" "Much more than we can afford to pay," interrupted Rara. "Alter, come with me. This boy is going to talk you out of a unit or two yet, if you keep on listening to him." "See," said the boy, pointing to the shells. "I've put holes in them already. You can string them around your neck." "If you want to get food and a place to sleep," said Alter, "you don't want money. You want friends. What's your name? And where are you from?" The boy looked up from the handful of shells, surprised. "My name is Tel," he said after a moment. "I come from the mainland coast, and I'm a fisherman's son. I thought when I came here I could get a job in the aquariums. That's all you hear about on the coast." Alter smiled. "First of all, you're sort of young." "But I'm a good fisherman." "And also, it's very different from fishing on a boat. I guess you'd say that there were a lot of jobs in the aquariums and the hydroponics gardens, but with all the immigrants, there are 3 people for every job." The boy shrugged. "Well, I can try." "That's right," said Alter. "Come on, walk with us." Rara huffed. "We'll take him back to Geryn's place and see if we can get him some food. He can probably stay there a little while if Geryn takes a liking to him." "You can't just take every homeless barnacle you find back to Geryn's." "You'll have it crawling with every shrimp in the pot. And suppose he doesn't take a liking to him?"
Suppose he decides to kick us out in the street." The birthmark on her left cheek darkened. "Aunt Rara, please," said Alter. "I'll handle Geryn." Rara huffed once more. "How come, when we're 2 weeks behind on the rent, you can't find a kind word in your mouth for the old man when he threatens to throw us onto the street, yet for the sake of a handful of pretty shells " "Please." A breeze seeped through the narrow street, picked a shock of Alter's white hair and flung it back from her shoulder. "Anyway, Geryn may be able to use him. If Tel's stowed away, that means he doesn't have any papers." Tel frowned with puzzlement. Rara frowned with chastisement in her eyes. "You are not supposed to refer to that, ever." "Don't be silly," said Alter. "It's just a fantasy of Geryn's anyway. It'll never happen. And without papers, Tel can't get a job at the aquariums, even if they wanted him. So if Geryn thinks he can fit him into his crazy plan, Tel will come out a lot better than if he had some old 10 unit a week factory job. Look, Rara, how can Geryn possibly kidnap?" "Be quiet," snapped Rara. "And even if he did, what good is it going to do? It's not as if it were the king himself." "I don't understand," said Tel. "That's good," said Rara. "And if you want to keep going with us, you won't try to find out." "We can tell you this much," said Alter. "The man who owns the inn where we stay wants to do something. Now, he is a little crazy. He's always talking to himself, for example. But he needs someone who has no identification registered in the city. Now, if he thinks he can use you, you'll get free food and a place to sleep. He used to be the gardener on the island estate of the Duchess of Petra, but he drank a little too much, and I guess at last he had to go. He still says she sends him messages, though, about his plan. But " "You don't have to go any further," Rara said curtly. "You'll hear about it from him," said Alter. "Why did you stow away?" "I just got fed up with life at home. We'd work all day to catch fish, and then have to leave them rotting on the beach because we could only sell a fifth of them, or sometimes none at all. Some people came up. Some only managed to get it in their heads that they had to work harder. I guess my father was like that. He figured if he worked enough, someone would just have to buy them. Only nobody did. My mother did some hand weaving, and we were living mostly on that. Finally, I figured I was eating up more than I was worth, so I left." "Just like that? And with no money?" asked Rara. "Just like that," Tel said. "You poor boy," said Rara, and in a sudden fit of maternal affection she put her arm around his shoulder. "Ow!" cried Tel, and winced. Rara jerked her hand away. "What's the matter?" "I got hurt there," the boy said, rubbing his shoulders gently. "Hurt? How?" "My father, he whipped me there." "Ah," said Rara. "Now it comes out. Well, whatever the reasons you left, they're your own business. Anyway, I've never known anyone yet to do something for one reason alone. Don't lag behind now. We'll be back at Geryn's in time for lunch." "I thought if I could sneak aboard," went on Tel, "that they'd have to let me off in the city, even if I didn't have any money. I didn't know about papers. And when I was in line, I figured I'd explain to the men at the desk. Or maybe I'd even give them my shells, and they would get the papers for me. But the guy ahead of me had a mistake in his. Some date was wrong, and they said they were going to send him back to the mainland, and that he couldn't leave the ship. He said he'd give them real money, and even got it out of his pocket. But they started to take him away. That's when I ran out of line and jumped the fence. I didn't know everyone else would run too." "Probably half their papers were out of order too, or forged. That's why they ran." "You're a cynic, Aunt Rara." "I'm a practical woman." As they turned another corner, The boy's green eyes jumped at the blue hazed towers of the palace, distant behind the wealthy roofs of merchants' mansions, themselves behind the hive houses and the spreading ruin of tenements. He tried to memorize the twisting street they followed. He couldn't. There were two general, contradictory impressions in his mind. First, of being enclosed in these tiny alleys, some so small that two could not pass through them with arms held out. The second, of the spreading, immense endlessness of the city. He tried to tell Alter what he felt, but after a minute of broken sentences she smiled at him and shook her head. "No, I don't understand. What do you mean?" And a sudden picture of the seaside leapt into his head. The yellow length of the beach lashed across his mind so that it stung. He could see the salt and pepper rocks shoaling away and knobbed with periwinkle shells. He could see the brown and green fingers of seaweed clutching the sand when the waves went out. He blinked the gray city back into his eyes. Tears washed the broken curb, the cracked walls, washed the rusted metal window jamb sharp and clean again. "He means he's homesick," Rara interpreted. "No, boy," she said. "It'll never go away, but it'll get less." The street turned sharply twice, then widened. "Well," said Alter, "here we are." A red circular plaque hung over the door of the only stone building on the block. It was 2 stories, twice the height of the other structures. They entered. Beams of real wood were set into the low ceiling. By one wall was a counter. There was a large table in the middle, and coming down into the room in a large V was a stairway. Of the men and women sitting around the room, one caught Tel's eye immediately. He was perhaps 7 feet and a handful of inches tall, and was sitting, spraddle-legged, at the table. He had a long, flat, equine face, and a triplex of scars started on his cheek, veered down to his neck, and disappeared under his collarless shirt. As Tel watched, he turned to a plate of food he was eating, so that his scars disappeared. Suddenly, from the stairs top, a harpoon-straight old man appeared. He hurried down, his white hair spiking out in all directions. Reaching the bottom, he whirled around, darting black eyes to every person in the room. "All right," he said. "I've received the message. I've received the message, and it's time." Alter whispered to Tel, "That's Geryn." "Are we all here?" the old man demanded. "Are we all here now?" A woman at the counter snickered. Suddenly Geryn turned toward Tel, Alter, and Rara. "You!" he demanded. His pointing finger wavered so they could not tell which of the 3 he meant. "You mean him?" asked Alter, pointing to Tel. Geryn nodded vigorously. "What are you doing here? Are you a spy?" "No, sir," said Tel. Geryn stepped around the table and looked at him closely. The black eyes were 2 sharp spots of darkness in a face the color of shipboards gone 2 winters without paint. "Geryn," Alter said. "Geryn, he isn't a spy. He's from the mainland. And Geryn, he doesn't have any papers either. He's stowed away." "You're not a spy?" Geryn demanded again. "No, sir," Tel repeated. Geryn backed away. "I like you," he said. "I trust you." Slowly he turned away. Then he whirled back. "I have no choice, you see. It's too late. The message has come, so I need you." "Huh." He laughed. Then the laugh stopped short as if sliced by a razor. He put his hands over his eyes, and then brought his finger down slowly. "I'm tired," he said. "Rara, you owe me rent. Pay up or I'll kick you all out. I'm tired." He walked heavily toward the bar. "Give me something to drink. In my own tavern you can give me something to drink." Someone laughed again. Tel looked at Alter. "Well," she said, "he likes you." "He does?" "Mm-hmm," she nodded. "Oh," said Tel.
At the bar, Geryn drained a large glass of pale green liquid, slammed the empty glass on the board, and cried out, "The war! Yes, the war!" "Oh, here we go," Alter whispered. Geryn ran his finger slowly along the rim of the glass. "The war," he said again. He turned suddenly. "It's coming," he declaimed. "And do you know why it's coming? Do you know how it's coming? We can't stop it. Not now. Not any more. I've received the signal, so there's no hope left. We must just go ahead and try to save something. Something to start and build from again." Geryn looked directly at Tel. "Boy, do you know what a war is?" "No, sir," said Tel, which wasn't exactly true. He'd heard the word. "Hey," someone cried from the bar. "Are we gonna get stories? Great fires and destruction again?" Geryn ignored the cry. "Do you know what the Great Fire was?" Tel shook his head. "The world was once much bigger than it is today," Geryn said. "Once man flew not just between island and mainland, island and island, but skirted the entire globe of the earth. Once man flew to the moon, even to the moving lights in the sky. There were empires, like Toromon, only bigger. And there were many of them. Often they fought with one another, and that was called a war. And the end of the final war was the Great Fire. That was over 1,500 years ago. Most of the world, from what little we know of it today, is scarred with strips of impassable land. The sea is run through with deadly currents. Only fragments of the earth, widely separated, can hold life. Toromon may be the only one, for all we are sure of. And now we will have another war." Someone from the bar yelled, "So what if it comes? It might bring some excitement." Geryn whirled. "You don't understand." He whipped one hand through his shocked white hair. "What are we fighting? We don't know. It's something mysterious and unnameable on the other side of the radiation barrier. Why are we fighting?" "Because," began a bored voice at the bar. "Because," interrupted Geryn, suddenly pointing directly at Tel's face, "we have to fight. Toromon has gotten into a situation where its excesses must be channeled towards something external. Our science has outrun our economics. Our laws have become stricter, and we say it is to stop the rising lawlessness. But it is to supply workers for the mines that the laws tighten. Workers who will dig more tetron, that more citizens shall be jobless, and must therefore become lawless to survive. 10 years ago, before the aquariums, fish was 5 times its present price. There was perhaps 4% unemployment in Toron. Today, the prices of fish are a fifth of what they were, yet unemployment has reached 25% of the city's populace. A quarter of our people starve. More arrive every day. What will we do with them? We will use them to fight a war. Our university turns out scientists whose science we can not use lest it put more people out of work. What will we do with them? We will use them to fight a war. Eventually, the mines will flood us with tetron. Too much for even the aquariums and the hydroponic gardens. It will be used for the war." "Then what?" asked Tel. "We do not know who or what we are fighting," repeated Geryn. "We will be fighting ourselves, but we will not know it. According to the books, it is customary in a war to keep each side in complete ignorance of the other, or give them lies like those we use to frighten children instead of truth. But here the truth may be." His voice trailed off. "What's your plan?" Tel asked. There was another laugh at the bar. "Somehow," and his voice was lower,
Somehow, we must get ready to save something. Salvage some fragment from the destruction that will come. There are only a few of us who know all this, who understand it, who know what has to be done."
"What is that?"
Tel asked again. Suddenly Geryn whirled. "Drinks!" he called. "Drinks all around!" The quiet amusement and general lethargy disappeared as the people moved to the bar. "Drink up, friends, my fellows!" cried Geryn.
"Your plan?"
Tel asked again, puzzled. "I'll tell you," answered the old man, almost in a whisper. "I'll tell you. But not just yet. Not just." He turned back again. "Drink up!" Three men, who already had their glasses, gave a cheer. "Are you with me, friends?" Geryn demanded.
"We're with you,"
Six more cried, laughing, clinking their glasses hard on the table top as Tel looked from Alter to Rara and back. "My plan," began Geryn. "Have you all had a glass? All of you? Another round for everybody. Yes, a second round." There was a solid cheer now. Glass bottoms turned toward the ceiling, then whammed on the counter top again. "My plan is to you understand it's not just my plan, but only a small part in a great plan, a plan to save us all. My plan is to kidnap Prince Let from the palace. That's the part that we must do. Are you with me, friends?" A yell rose, and somebody had started a friendly fight at the end of the bar. Then Geryn's voice suddenly broke through the sound, low, in a grating whisper that silenced them for seconds. "Because you must be with me. The time is tonight. I have it planned." The voices halted, and then heaved to a roar. "Tonight," repeated Geryn, though hardly anyone could hear him. "I have it planned. Only you've got to be with me." Tel frowned, and Alter shook her head. The old man had closed his eyes for a moment. Rara was beside him, her hand on his shoulder. "You're going to get yourself sick with all this yelling. Let me get you up to your room." As she turned him toward the stairs, the scarred giant who had been given a drink now rose from the table, looked straight at Geryn, then drained his glass. Geryn nodded, drew a breath through his teeth, and then allowed Rara to lead him up the stairs as Tel and Alter watched. The noise among the drinking men and women at the bar increased. End of chapter 3.